Un tā, dāmas un kungi, mēs esam gatavi pāriet mazliet citā darba režīmā. Mūsu atklāšanas runas ir noslēgušās un zināmā mērā tās ir kalpojušas kā tāds tīzerītis pētījumam, kas tūlīt tiks atklāts smalkākā detalizācijas pakāpē. Par ziņojumu ir krietni liela interese arī preses pārstāvjiem, tāpēc šis ir tas brīdis, kad mēs Skarpetes kungu un ministrs kundzi varam droši aicināt doties sarunai ar presi un ar draudzīgiem skatieniem mēs jūs pavadīsim vēlot veiksmi sarunā ar presi un atbildot uz jautājumiem. Savukārt mēs pārējam tehniskākā darba režīmā. Ko tas nozīmē? Dāmas un kungi, mums ir iespēja arī uzdot jautājumus. Tātad tagad mums būs prezentācija, kurā mēs redzēsim smalkāk pētījuma datus. Un ja jums rodas jautājumi, mēs tos aicinam adresēt elektroniskā veidā. Kā tas notiek? Jums uz vārdu kartiņām un arī šeit uz ekrāniem ir redzama būtiska informācija, dāmas un kungi. Tātad mēs atrodamies zinātņu mājā, un šī telpa ir mazliet zemāka, un tāpēc ierastās mobilās iekārtas var nestrādāt, jo dažam labam neķer tīkls, tā kā, piemēram, man. Tāpēc mēs varam pieslēgties bezvadu tīmeklim. Un tur ir sistēma ļoti vienkārši. Mums ir jāizvēlās Latvijas Universitātes tīkls, jāievada VLAN 15, tas mums arī ir uz vārda kartiņām, un parole ziema, pavasaris. Pozitīvi, ziema, pavasaris, nevis pavasaris, ziema, tas būtu depresīvi. Ziema, pavasaris, tas ir normāli, uz attīstību vērsti. Tātad Latvijas Universitāte, VLAN 15 un parole ziema, pavasaris. Tā mēs pieslēdzamies internetam. Un tad mēs dodamies tālāk, šī informācija arī uz jūsu vārdu kartiņām, slido.com, jeb latviskāk slido.com, un ievadam 6232 kodu, kas ir mūsu pasākuma kods. Un tur jūs varat likt savus jautājumus visas dienas garumā, un tad, kad mums būs diskusiju sadaļa, mēs šos te jautājumus neapšaubām arī uzdosim. Jautājumi ir redzami visiem, cenzūra nepastāv. Ko uzdosiet, to pajautāsim. Līdz ar to šeit mēs aicinām uzdot jautājumus, un, protams, dienas gaitā arī dzīvā veidā jautājumus varēs uzdot ar vecā labā mikrofona starpniecību. Tātad šis ir tas tehniskais iekārtojums, kā mēs to darīsim. Un tagad, dāmas un kungi, mēs esam gatavi ķerties klāt arī pašu pētījumu detalizētam izklāstam. Ladies and gentlemen, now is the moment when we're gonna ask here on the stage the team which was providing the report, and my pleasure is to invite here Teodora Ksenojani with applause, please. Džonatans Leins, also with applause from OECD, and from Latvian part, Irina Možajeva, researcher, Latvian University, Latvijas Universitātes pētniece arī šeit uz skatumi. Tad lūdzu aicinu Teodoru, Džonatanu un Irīnu daliet savu darbu, kā jūs to darat. Wonderful, wonderful. And now we have a scientific environment, which means in an easygoing mode, telling everything what's most important. Please, the floor is yours.
So, just a quick word to thank you all, to thank the State Secretary and the Deputy State Secretary, to thank all the participants and the experts. Most importantly, to thank the authorities for this excellent cooperation, which started about 2 years ago, a bit less than 2 years ago. And actually, I do see lots of familiar faces around the room, people we met with when we visited Riga several times. This is a joint work. The authors of this report have already been mentioned, but I think it is important to say that Džonatans Leins, who is here with us and will actually present part of this presentation today, Irina Možajeva, who is our local expert who worked with us from the beginning till the end of this project, but also my colleague Friedrich Poschel, who is now taking care of another important topic for Latvia, immigration and emigration, and was unfortunately unable to join us, but he did a lot of the analysis in this report, and he did draft many of the chapters of this report. So I wanted to thank all of them for their work. So let me first give you the outline of this presentation. First, we will present to you the background. Some of this has already been mentioned by Stefan. Actually, parts of the presentation will be quite repetitive, so we'll try to move quickly through these parts. the scope, the focus, the objectives of this review, but also the way we worked with you and the way we worked back home in Paris. Then we will present recent trends, first labor market trends and the remaining challenges, and actually Stefano has already mentioned many of them, then trends in active labor market policies, and trends in benefit recipiency. I mean, the benefit system is, let's say, looked at in this review, but only marginally to the extent that there is an interaction between active labor market policies and passive policies. Then we will talk about the data, and again, we heard a lot about this since this morning, but actually it's a key element of this review. Without the rich and good quality data we received from the Latvian authorities, we would not have been able to do this work, and we really appreciate that. Then we will present the results in more detail in comparison to what Stefano did this morning of the impact evaluation of the three main programs, training programs, regional mobility program, and the employment subsidies. If we do have time at the very end, we will briefly touch upon two other programs, the scheme for entrepreneurship and self-employment, and then public works. But this is only if we have the time. And then we will close with just a summary of the key policy recommendations. So the OECD has actually worked on active labor market policies for a very, very long time, many decades of work. Today, we work in different ways with countries. First, we produce these kinds of country reviews, which, I mean, as it was said this morning, that's the thickest book, but we have also produced very good quality, let's say, smaller books focusing on specific topics that are of interest to a specific country. The next review will be that of Italy with a totally different focus, because there the discussion is more about cooperation between national authority, managing employment, active labor market measures, and the regional authorities, and another of other countries. We also organize peer learning events where countries can learn from each other. The most recent one was on profiling tools, and I think this is a topic of interest to Latvia. And we did produce a policy brief of profiling tools and a working paper which summarize the practices across OECD countries. Then we also provide, let's say, tailored inputs into developing and implementing reforms and our policy recommendations. And from this year, we work closely with the European Union, the Structural Reform Support Service of the European Union, to provide specific implementation support to countries in the area of active labor market policies. And of course, we do our own data collection in cooperation with the European Union, with DG Employment, and we conduct impact evaluation when this is possible, as was the case of Latvia. So what is the focus, the objectives, and the scope of this review? We were asked in the beginning three key questions, and that's what the review tried to answer. What role active labor market policies play in Latvia's labor market? The second, how do they contribute? Do they contribute to an inclusive labor market? And what is their role their effect for the long-term unemployed and other vulnerable groups? So what is the purpose of this review? The purpose is to make recommendations for improvement of these measures. It's to inform the Inclusive Employment Strategy 2015 and 2020, and then it's also to strengthen the capacity of the country to regularly monitor and evaluate the active labor market measures. So how did we work? Well, as I said, actually, we agreed to do this review about 2 years ago, but we came for the first time to Riga in September 2017, and the project ends today with the presentation of these results. We first built on existing evidence, because there was quite a bit of existing evidence. There were OECD reviews, the review of social labor market policies that was done in the context of the accession of Latvia to the OECD, but also a more recent review focusing on youth, There was also the World Bank report of 2013, which focused on unemployment, inactivity, and poverty, and that was also an extremely useful resource for us. And our work with Irina has also been very important because Irina was also involved in the World Bank project, and she has expertise and experience in using the linked administrative data of Latvia. We have also used a variety of data sources in the OECD, EU Labour Force Surveys, the National Labour Force Survey, and most importantly, the linked administrative data that you provided to us. And finally, we have cooperated very, very closely with the authorities. It was an exceptional and excellent cooperation. We had the fact-finding mission in September 2017. We actually sent to many of you a policy questionnaire, which helped us a lot to identify, even before coming here, some of the challenges that the country was facing. And we had very frequent exchanges with the relevant institutions, the Ministry of Welfare, the State Employment Agency, and others. So the structure of the review, there is an introductory chapter which summarizes the conclusions of the review and the key policy recommendations. There is one on the trends and challenges in the Latvia labor market, one on the design and the delivery of active labor market policies. So this is focusing more, let's say, on what programs are available, how this has changed, what is the outreach of the State Employment Agency, etc. Then you have the three chapters which focus more on the impact evaluation of the three programs, one focusing on labor market policies for skills and employability, including the training program, then focus on encouraging regional mobility and entrepreneurship, and finally, one looking more at Latvia's vulnerable groups, including the evaluation of the program for subsidized employment. So now I would like to move on to the recent labor market trends and challenges. This is a similar figure to the one that Stefano presented earlier. So you do see the big impact of the crisis on the unemployment rates in Latvia, which reached its peak at 20% towards the end of 2009 and beginning of 2010. Today is 8%. It has been fallen to less than half its record level during the crisis. I would like to add, a few information about the groups that are more heavily affected by unemployment. This concerns mainly older men in Latvia, youth, and persons with a low level of education. Actually, the differences between persons with low and high levels of education are quite substantial. So the unemployment rate for those with higher education is 4%, whereas the unemployment rate for those with a low level of education is 21%. So really substantive differences there. So that was, let's say, the good news, because unemployment has fallen indeed a lot, but there's a number of challenges. One of them, as Stefano mentioned this morning, is the number of discouraged workers. And how are these defined? These are defined based on European Union Labour Force Survey data, which identify those inactive persons of working age who do not seek work anymore because they believe that they will not find any. So in some way, they are not included in the definition, the ILO definition of unemployment, but they are people who, in theory, are looking actually for work, or they should be looking for work. So this is a self-reported status of discouraged workers, okay? So today, we count about, today, in 2016, we count about 20,000 discouraged workers in Latvia. That is still substantial, but it's well below the record level of 47,000 people in 2010. So the number of discouraged workers is quite high in Latvia in comparison to other European OECD countries. They represent about 5% of Latvia's non-employed working age population. And this is above many OECD countries, except some that were heavily affected by the crisis. So who are mainly these discouraged workers? Again, education and prior work experience determine to a large extent whether a person is a discouraged worker or not. Those with low education level and those with little work experience are those that are mainly concerned here. The second challenge, also identified earlier by Stefano, is the persistent long-term unemployment. So 3.3% of the labor force were unemployed for more than 12 months. This is close to twice the OECD average in 2017, so quite substantial. And the long-term unemployed made up about 38% of all unemployed people in Latvia. Again, there are big differences, and education level is one of the factors explaining, let's say, higher or lower long-term unemployment rate. But there is also another factor, which is the reason why the previous job ended. So, for example, for persons who report that they stopped working because of illness or disability, the long-term unemployment share is much higher than for those who were just, who just lost their job. So, another challenge concerns differences between countries. I will go through that quite quickly because Jonathan will come back to that in some way when he presents the regional mobility program. I mean, this is not news to you. There are sharp differences between Latvia's regions, and actually the regional divide in Latvia is among the highest in the OECD. Given these large differences between regions, it is important to consider ways to, let's say, address this issue and to promote regional mobility of unemployed persons. So that could be considered as, let's say, a policy objective. So this will be elaborated by Jonathan later on when he presents the State Employment Agency's Regional Mobility Program, which aims to encourage unemployed people to take up job offers, even if they have to move, let's say, to another area. An alternative way to address this challenge and the regional differences is through the support to set up businesses in the regions. And there is a small but quite effective, it seems, a program for entrepreneurship and self-employment, which will be, I hope, briefly discussed towards the end of this presentation. So now I would like to give the floor to Jonathan. This is a long presentation, so we have agreed between us to share the floor so that you don't get bored. The voice tone will be a little bit different, and we hope to make it for the lunch break at noon without boring you too much.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Teodora, and thank you everyone for being here today, and thank you to those once more who've contributed a great deal to this report. It's really, really exciting to have been kind of involved very intensely in the use of all the microdata, frustrating at times, but also incredibly rewarding, and it's just incredibly exciting to have the opportunity to talk through all the results that we've been able to come to today. What I'd like to do is just talk a little bit. So Teodora mentioned some of the trends in the labour market at large. What I'd like to do is talk about some of the recent trends in the specifics of active labour market policies in Latvia. And again, Stefano touched on some of these earlier today, but it's useful for us to go into a little bit more depth as we try and understand the evaluation work that we have done in this review. So as Stefano touched upon, the menu of active labour market policies in Latvia has expanded in recent years. And there's really kind of two sort of elements to this. One is the overall level of the expansion. So we're seeing that overall kind of participations have increased in all different types of labour market policies on average. But also something that's been touched upon before, the focus has really shifted towards disadvantaged groups, be that persons with disabilities, the long-term unemployed, and young people as well. And this is really, in keeping with the inclusive labour market strategy 2015 to 2020. So in a sense, some of these trends that we see are sort of no surprise from the perspective not just of expansion, but also of focusing on disadvantaged groups more intensely. What does this mean in practice? Well, what we've seen is some new programs have been introduced. One on regional mobility is one that we'll talk about a little bit in more detail later on. But also, there's been a sort of focus on the long-term unemployed specifically, and as you can see, the kind of support for long-term unemployed number, which is the kind of fourth row down, has really increased it quite drastically in the last few years, in particular. And what does this mean? Well, this includes things that relate to people's motivation. It could be mentoring. It could be short workshops to really tackle that discouragement and tackle the cycle of unemployment that affects some people. But also some people who come under that long-term unemployed category need sort of extra rehabilitation. And so those kind of programs would fall into that category as well. On young people, Stefano mentioned earlier the impact of the Youth Guarantee, which comes in 2014. And this is the commitment of EU member states to offer every young person either employment or some form of education within 4 months of leaving school. And so that really affects all sorts of components of Latvia's menu of active labour market policies right across the board. But to be more specific, many of the training programs are covered by the Youth Guarantee. Some of the regional mobility programs are also covered by the Youth Guarantee, and the same applies to subsidised jobs. So this is really something that cuts across many of these different types of measures, but really puts an extra emphasis on young people in Latvia. And as I mentioned, sort of long-term unemployed people are across the board generally more likely to be participating in active labour market policies than registered unemployed people at large. In fact, the rates at which long-term unemployed people participate in these measures is roughly double sort of the overall rate at which people participate. So there's been sort of this shift in emphasis towards disadvantaged groups that I think comes quite clearly across in these numbers. And one just final thing that I think is interesting to mention for the context of the employment subsidies evaluation about which Teodora will be speaking later, there's been a sort of slow shift away from providing direct employment support through public works and moving that towards subsidised jobs. So that's kind of a mega trend that I think will be important to pick up again later. Now, this is again repeating something that Stefano mentioned, but I'd like to touch on it a little bit more depth. Despite these kind of increases, spending on active labour market policies in Latvia remains relatively low. These are data from 2016, and as we saw, expenditures in Latvia are, as a percentage of GDP, are sort of 0.19% of GDP going towards either expenditure on active labour market policies or on the Public Employment Service or the State Employment Agency, as it is in Latvia. Which is the sixth lowest allocation, budget allocation towards such policies amongst OECD countries, with the OECD average being about 0.53 percentage points of GDP, percent of GDP on average going towards these sorts of policies. Now, I should mention that these numbers kind of include what we would call like the substantive active labour market policies. So that could be trainings, that could be employment subsidies. What they don't include is some of the shorter workshops, which have kind of proliferated in Latvia in recent years. So that might be one source of potential bias here. But I think the overall that will affect all countries to some extent as well. And so the overall trend, I think we can be fairly sure that spending is low. There's also an issue that the ratio between spending on active labour market policies as compared to passive labour market policies, so that's benefits and income support, is relatively low in Latvia compared to other OECD countries. So it's not just a case that spending is low on active labour market policies. Also, in terms of the spending on labour market policies at large, a relatively small proportion of that is going towards activation rather than benefits and passive labour market policies. And unsurprisingly, this translates to what we see in terms of coverage and participation. What we have here in this chart, again, is something that was touched on earlier, but this is the proportion of the registered unemployed and the proportion of the jobless seeking work. So that's a kind of different measure of unemployed people that includes not just the registered, but also unregistered unemployed as well. And what we see is about 11% of the registered unemployed are participating in active labour market policy. So that low spending is translating into relatively low participation compared to other OECD countries. One thing I think is kind of interesting to mention, just to kind of tee up something that Irina will be talking about later on, is that the proportion of people participating in active labour market policies is far lower amongst the registered unemployed than it is amongst the jobless seeking work at large, which is kind of pointing towards a trend we see in Latvia where registration is relatively low. And so that's kind of what this next slide is focusing on. So, I mean, in order to reach people, in order to have an effect on people's labour market outcomes, the State Employment Agency needs people to register, needs people to be involved, and needs people to be kind of on their radar in order for these active labour market policies to become available to those people. In recent years, what we've seen, however, is that only about half of the sort of jobless seeking work, the broader sort of group of unemployed people, those who are looking for jobs, have registered with the State Employment Agency. And unfortunately, registration is kind of particularly weak amongst the long-term unemployed. So, you know, while less than half of those with an unemployment duration of less than 6 months are registered with the State Employment Agency, around 3/4 of the long-term unemployed are not registered. So, you know, in terms of that effort to help disadvantaged people, this issue of registration and the places amongst the population, the sort of specific groups among the population where that registration or non-registration falls, I think this is a kind of particularly important issue. One reason that this might kind of arise is that the structure of the benefit system in Latvia. Registration is with the State Employment Agency is a precondition for receiving not just unemployment benefit, but also the guaranteed minimum income and other types of social assistance as well. But after that employment benefit expires after 9 months, only certain groups of people will receive guaranteed minimum income. Those receipts of guaranteed minimum income are means tested, so this is mainly going to the poorest in the population. And so that means many people don't qualify for these types of benefits. And in that circumstance, the incentives to register or the incentives to stay register are relatively low, particularly given the hassle costs that might be associated with being registered at the State Employment Agency. So this is something that Irina will touch on in more detail, but I thought it's useful to flag the impact that the benefit system has on the efforts of the State Employment Agency to support people, but particularly to support disadvantaged groups. Of course, it's not just potential employees or unemployed people that we need to register with the State Employment Agency or with public employment services more broadly. Public employment services and the State Employment Agency also need to have contact with employers. We need to know where the vacancies are in order to help connect unemployed people with those jobs. And yet, unfortunately, vacancy registration, as the graph on the left shows with the dotted blue line, seems to be relatively low as a share of hirings in Latvia, particularly sort of dropping after the financial crisis. So what this means is people are potentially finding other ways into work. It could be through sort of direct applications. It could be through friends and families and other sorts of networks. And indeed, this is what we see from kind of survey data and anecdotal evidence in Latvia. But of course, this is important because it's very difficult for the State Employment Agency to connect people with employers if the vacancies aren't posted. So this remains something that sort of can be one of those areas for improvement, making it as easy as possible to register vacancies, be that through ICTs, or be that through using kind of web scraping, or be that through sort of reducing the kind of administrative burden that employers have to face when they register vacancies with the State Employment Agency. All of these things are likely to have a kind of positive impact and something that should be sought out in terms of improving the role that the State Employment Agency can have in connecting people with jobs. I'd just like to mention one sort of specific aspect of the way that the State Employment Agency functions, because I think this is important for the sort of evaluations that come up in just a moment. But also kind of it's a kind of key aspect of the way that the State Employment Agency functions, and something that's been introduced relatively recently in Latvia and is potentially up for reform. And that's the way that the individuals are profiled when they register. This is the process of working out what types of unemployed people we have, so we can better streamline and differentiate the services that go towards them. The way this works in Latvia, as of sort of 2017, looks a little bit like this. There's sort of several steps to profiling individuals to work out what services would best suit them. And the system is actually relatively complicated compared to other OECD countries, so I think that's one kind of thing to take away. The first step involves an electronic questionnaire, so any people that register with the State Employment Agency need to fill out some basic information, be it on their age, their place of residence, education, language skills. But these are all entered manually by someone filling in the questionnaire themselves. And this enables each individual to have a skills score, a sort of measure of the level of skills they have and what that can sort of bring to the labour market. After that electronic questionnaire, there's an intensive personal interview between the sort of a registered unemployed person and the caseworker. And this is really to assess individuals' motivations for finding work and their sort of motivation to cooperate with the State Employment Agency in its efforts to provide sort of relevant active labour market policies. So that's a kind of second sort of administratively burdensome step, shall we say. And then, sort of in a final step, there's an assignment between one of three groups, which kind of assesses labour market conditions at that time, sort of thinking about whether it's a potentially good time to be finding jobs or not such a good one, and thinking about what risks that poses to registered unemployed people. And so, going through all these kind of three fairly complicated and fairly intensive steps, we end up with assignment to one of potentially 39 groups. 39 is a very big number. So 39 different profiles of unemployed people is far higher than what we'd see potentially in other OECD countries. And so, you know, we didn't do a formal evaluation of the profiling system, but we did sort of think qualitatively about what the intensity and the way that this works might mean in terms of the effectiveness of that profiling system. Firstly, I mean, as I mentioned, I think one potential improvement might be to reduce the number of groups that the profiling tool leads to. Having those three steps and having 39 different profiles of unemployed people spat out by the system potentially makes it very complicated to link different profiles to differentiated services. And so, yeah, compared to other OECD countries, this is far, far higher. We did some work on Australia, Austria, and Germany, and the number of profiles of unemployed people or registered unemployed people in those countries and in those profiling systems is far less than 39. One sort of advantage of reducing the number of groups and being able to differentiate the service streams early is that we can quickly find out whether certain groups could benefit instead of intensive kind of casework interaction from online services rather. So this enables those individuals that are likely to resume work quickly and have a high potential to get back to work with limited interaction with the State Employment Agency to just get that little boost they need. And again, this is something where the OECD has worked or learned from experiences in the Netherlands, where online services to individuals and registered and employed people has been an effective policy there. And just one final thing, which I think builds on what we've been talking about in terms of data that might improve the profiling system in Latvia, is making better use of statistical information that already exists. Irina will talk in just a moment about some of the benefits of using administrative data for evaluation, for monitoring and evaluation purposes. But for the actual functioning of the State Employment Agency, there's an awful lot we can learn about people's employability, their education, and their labour market experience from existing and very detailed administrative data. So these are all potential things that could improve this specific aspect of profiling that might be worth bearing in mind as we move on to the evaluations to come. And so I'll hand over to Irina now to have yet another change in voice.
Thank you very much. Yes, floor is yours. Some applause to Irina because she's first time today on the stage.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Theodora. I should say that I'm honored to be a part of this amazing team of experts and to represent Latvia in this particularly important project for my country. So I will proceed briefly with some recent trends in benefit recipiency and will touch the issue of benefit dependency. This graph represents the share of beneficiaries of various types of benefits within a population age 15 and over. So as you can see, reliance on social assistance benefits has reduced during the observation period, which starts with January of 2012 and ends with October of 2017. This analysis is based on the administrative data, which were mentioned during this project. And as you can see, the reliance on social assistance benefits has diminished from 4% among the population age 15 and over to below 2% in the end of the observation period. And the waves, the cyclicality you observe is related to housing benefits, which are paid by municipalities and compensate for example, the tops of the waves reflect compensation for heating during heating period. Reliance on GMI has diminished also 4 times during the observation period, from 2% to about 0.5%. On the contrast, reliance on disability benefits and stock of disability beneficiaries has increased, and this increase has been observed also during the crisis period. So you can see that the stock of disability beneficiaries is growing, and it's not only due to population aging. We observe considerable growth of working age disabled. And the good feature is that employment within the group of the officially disabled is also increasing. So at the beginning of the observation period, it was at about 30%, and at the end, it was at about 36%. This increase goes in line with another observed indicator. As some of you probably know, the application for disability benefits goes in line with registration of occupational diseases. And the number of first-time occupational patients in the end of 2017 was twice greater than in 2007. And the number of registered occupational diseases was twice greater, which means that we do not expect this tendency to diminish. So those applications to disability benefits, increasing numbers of stock of disability beneficiaries will be observed in the future. Let's now look at the unemployment benefit recipients and their length of stay on the unemployment benefits. So as you can see on the left-hand side, on the panel A, which represents percentage of recipients by number of months on unemployment benefits, about 1/3 of all recipients stayed on the benefit for up to 3 months. And about the same share, about 1/3 stayed on the benefit for their full length until they exhausted their full benefit entitlement. I should mention here that for these calculations, we used State Social Insurance Agency data. So benefit payments made by State Social Insurance data could be made in 10 different months, right? So this 10-point scale corresponds to 9 benefit months. If we take a look at the mean length of unemployment benefits spell, so we can see that although the indicator has decreased since economic crisis period, it's rather rigid. And rigidity of the mean length of unemployment benefits spell indicator is explained to a large extent by changes in the normative acts and the set of measures put in place in response to the crisis. So as you probably remember, during the crisis, the coverage of unemployment benefits has been expanded, but those with contribution history less than 10 years had the benefit of full entitlement for only 4 months, and for the next 5 months they were paid only 45 lats. So this forced a younger population to get back to the labor market more actively. Therefore, this indicator was affected negatively, so downward effect. Otherwise, we would see much greater shift here. If we take a look at disability benefits and recipiency, if we take a stock of all the disability beneficiaries observed in our database and disaggregate them according to the length of stay on the benefit, we see that 37% of them stayed on the disability benefit during the entire observation period, which in our database is 70 months long. 15.5% stayed on the benefit for a year or less, but here I should mention again that the 91% of our observed disability benefit spells are censored, which means that either the observed benefit spell has started before the January 2012 or ended after October 2017. So true number of and true share of those who stay on the disability benefit for only a short period is even lower than shown here. And as you can see on the right panel, mostly those people who enter disability benefit scheme stay on it, and if they exit, they really rarely enter it again. In our database, only 2.3% of all disability benefits recipients return to the benefit if they exited the benefit during the observation period. So disability benefit recipiency is a really long-term dimension, and according to our analysis, after 2 years on the disability benefit, the probability that a person will exit the disability benefit is really, really low. And almost half of those who exited the disability benefit were exiting actually to retirement and old age pension. About a third were employed, which is very good, of course, but almost 1/5 remained absolutely inactive. And as this slide shows, employment and non-employment during disability spell is a strong predictor of subsequent labor market outcomes. Here we have analyzed all of those who exited disability benefit scheme during the observation period. And we have divided them into 3 different groups. Here is the group of those who were employed during 6 last disability benefit months. Here is a group of those who were employed for 1 till 5 months during the last 6 disability months. And here is a group of those who were not employed during the last half a year of their disability spell. And we look at their labor force status 1 month after exit. So here you can see that those who were employed actually stayed employed, or some share of them transited to retirement. For the second group, the employment indicator is twice smaller, but most of them also shared to retirement. And if we look at the third group and see their labor force status 1 month after exit and 6 months after exit, we can see that this indicator does not improve that much as we would expect. So it's relatively difficult to talk about benefit dependency as such. If we think about disability benefits, we rather speak about barriers related to health status as well as barriers related to long-term inactivity. If we look at GMI and the share of persons who received GMI during our observation period, that is from 2012 till 2017, we see that 1/3 of all GMI recipients stayed on the GMI only for 3 months or less, and another 25% stayed on GMI 4 to 6 months during the observation period. So this is quite a short-term support measure for most recipients. However, 1% of the observed GMI recipients stayed on the benefit for the entire observation period, that is 70 months. Number of spells per person reflected on the panel B says us that 60% of all of those who received GMI during the observation period had only one GMI benefit spell, and 40% returned to twice or more. For example, during the World Bank study, the data for pre-crisis and crisis periods told us that those who were on GMI only once, among all GMI benefit recipients, constituted only 40%. So this indicator is also improving. So GMI benefits spells are becoming shorter on average, and those who return to benefit constitute a lower share of all recipients. And here is some analysis that reflects those tendencies. We have used our data collected for 2012 till 17 and supplemented the analysis using World Bank data collected for the previous period and used data for 2010 and 11 and disaggregated all GMI recipients according to the total number of months spent on GMI benefit during the biennial period. So all the spells and returns and backs during this period are taken into account. So as you can see, the share of those who spent on GMI for up to 3 months has increased after the crisis. But also, among all GMI recipients, the share of those who remain on the benefit for a longer period, for 9 and above months, has also increased. And looking into those who stay on the GMI benefit for an extended period, we have disaggregated those who stayed on the benefit for 24 months here, and 22 here. Here we have less observation months because our observation period is cut at October of 2017. So we compared their socioeconomic profile. And one interesting finding is related to their disability status. In the latest 2 observation years, 44% of those persons who stayed on the GMI for the entire biennial period were actually persons with official disabilities, which is more than twice greater than in 2012-2013. On the one hand, this means that this group of the long-term GMI recipients becomes more and more stable in a sense that these people are more difficult to activate. And here we observe a reciprocal process of poverty and health. We know that persons with poor health are more likely to fall into poverty, and those persons who stay under the poverty threshold are more likely to face negative health outcomes. So to understand deeper this group of disabled persons, we looked into the data and found that actually 10% of those persons are persons with group 3 disability. So these are people that can be activated without very, very expensive measures. And they are not that old. A quarter of them is below 43, and half of them is below 53 years of age. Mostly they live in one-person households. 84% of them live in one-person households. So there are no people to take care of them. And those people might need further closer support. One may claim or argue that disability benefits defined in Latvia are above the income threshold defined for GMI recipients. But a number of municipalities in Latvia have designed policy and disaggregated a group of disabled for a higher GMI. For example, Riga, Jurmala, Rezekne, Kuldiga, and a few other municipalities define GMI at 128 euros for persons with official disability status. So this explains why so high number of disabled is found among the long-term GMI recipients. I will proceed with a small part related to our administrative data. As mentioned before, we are really grateful to our main data providers. A state employment agency in cooperation with UNISA provided us data on all the registered unemployed and job seekers. We know everything about their participation in different SEA programs and activities, and we obtained information on their personal characteristics. State Social Insurance Agency did an amazing job for us with their own means, providing us social insurance, data on social insurance benefits, pensions, wages, social contributions, as well as companies employing all the officially employed. ZZDATS provided us the data on social assistance, participation in public works program, low income and needy status, as well as household characteristics. I should mention that amazing work has been done by the Ministry of Welfare, who contacted all the municipalities in Latvia and negotiated on possibility to extract their data from the so-called SOPA database, administrative information system, which possesses all the data on social assistance programs. And amazing job has been done by Office of Citizenship and Migration Affairs. They have extracted for us data on the entire population of Latvia and provided information on year and month of birth, personal characteristics, declared place of residence, and changes in marital status. The job implemented within this project was not only complicated for us, but also for the providers, because we had to check all the data, go through all the variables, and some problems have been identified, and 2 institutions had to recollect the data. That reflects how complicated the data collection process actually was, especially given all the limitations. And these data have been linked together. They have been checked, harmonized, and linked together using the methodological approach elaborated by the World Bank team in 2012 and 2013. So these data are almost perfectly comparable to what we obtained from the previously collected data. However, there were some limitations. Despite this amazing database we obtained and richness of the data, we faced some limitations. The limitation number 1 is that we do not observe shadow economy here. Of course, all the administrative data contain information only on registered employment, on official wages. So everything on gray economy that could be grasped was grasped using survey data, including LFS. Another limitation is related to the observation period due to the fact that State Social Insurance Agency has transited to a new information system collecting the data we needed for this project before 2012 was not possible. And given the legal limitations, all the data queries had to contain all the same observation period defined. Some crucial information on previous labor market outcomes would be very helpful for our analysis and for our econometric models, but unfortunately, due to the above-mentioned reasons, it wasn't possible to get this information from SEA and State Social Insurance Agency data. And another important variable, education variable, was available only for the State Employment Agency clients, that is registered and employed. This was partly supplemented by the information available in SOPA database, but still we obtained education for only 26% of all the working age residents of Latvia. I should say that everyone who works with the Latvian data and all the things I hear about administrative data available in other countries, the conclusion is that our administrative data are really amazing, and the possibility to work with such data is nearly unique because our country is small enough to collect all the data on all the individuals registered in our country in a centralized way. In many other countries, this data are collected on a regional level, and combining them and approaching them is really problematic. And the quality as such of our administrative data is very, very high. So the possibility to work with such a rich database is what makes this project indeed unique. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
To Jonathan.
And we are switching over microphone back to Jonathan.
Yeah, back to me. So thanks very much, Irina. I think that was really great to just highlight once again the value of the administrative data for doing the work that we've been able to do. And now we're going to switch gears and move on a little bit to talk about the impact evaluations that were made, were only made possible by access to this amazing data set. So hopefully we can do justice to what we sort of collaborated on together in terms of data access. And to kick off, I'm going to talk about the training programs, which, as Stefano mentioned earlier, a set of programs that have kind of continued in Latvia. Unfortunately, he stole my punchlines about the success of these programs, but I'll go into a little bit more depth about the ways in which these training programs have worked. Just by means of context, we touched a little bit earlier on some of the structural issues that face the Latvian labour market. And one of the kind of paradoxes we see is that despite kind of long-term unemployment being where it is, despite discouragement of workers, there's actually skills shortages persisting in the Latvian economy. And some of the kind of key areas where we see these skills shortages persisting are in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, so STEM, but also in the service sector as well. So these are kind of two kind of sectors of the Latvian economy where skills are apparently in shortage. And we know this from cross-country evidence from the OECD Skills for Jobs database, which collects information on a range of indicators, including wage growth, employment growth, growth in hours worked, all sorts of things to try and triangulate where in the economy, which particular sectors skills shortages are persisting in. As well as these kind of specifics, we also know that there's some broad cross-cutting skills that are in shortage in the labour market in Latvia. The EURES, the European Job Mobility Portal survey data indicates that there's sort of employers are telling us there's cross-cutting skill shortages in information and communication technologies, even though that's an area of great investment, and the same applies for foreign languages. So we've got we've got both specific skills shortages, but also kind of cross-cutting more general ones as well. And so in a sense, this presents a kind of an opportunity in some ways for active labour market policies, because it means that training is a tenable strategy for getting people back into work. Of course, all that hinges on making sure that we can align the trainings that are provided under the menu of active labour market policies with the skills needs, not just of today, but also of the future in Latvia when people are approaching the labour market once more. And as many of you may know, like one important institution that guides this process for training for the unemployed in Latvia is the Training Commission, which brings together both short-term forecasts put together by the State Employment Agency, but also long-term forecasts put together by the Ministry of Economy, and incorporates information from a range of stakeholders, be that particular ministries, employers, and also unions, because it's sort of quite difficult to bring this information together, have that dialogue, and align trainings for the unemployed towards the right fields of study. So this is something that's relatively well developed in Latvia and makes us think that training is potentially, for those structural reasons, a potentially good activation strategy. Now, in terms of what the trainings in Latvia look like for the unemployed, there's really kind of two broad types of training for the unemployed that are offered. This is the formal training and sort of non-formal trainings. And the formal trainings are, in a sense, trying to tackle the first of those structural issues, the first of those skills shortages that we touched on in the previous slide, by trying to build up specific skills amongst people. That could be, all of this chart here is showing the types of skills that those formal trainings sought to build. These are generally longer in length, lasting about 3 months on average, but lasting anywhere up to kind of 202 days. So that's a long old while, and requiring sort of in general about 160 hours of contact time. and, as Stefano mentioned, leading to a professional qualification. So the formal trainings that are shown here are leading to something specific, something concrete, and something that can be taken clearly to address to a particular type of skills shortage in the labour market. On top of that, there's non-formal trainings which are about half as long and require about half the amount of contact time. And these generally focus not just on the ICTs, information and communication and technology skills, but also on the language skills that we touched on earlier, but also other skills such as driving, sort of operating particular types of machinery that might not be useful just in one sector, but useful across the board, and useful in terms of the skills that employers at large in Latvia are reporting to be important in terms of skills shortages. We, in our evaluation, focus on these formal trainings and the non-formal ones that I just mentioned a moment ago. What we don't do is focus on some of the shorter workshops. There's so-called measures to improve competitiveness in Latvia, which really try and train people in specifics of how they tackle the labour market, their interview technique, their networking, their sort of ability to develop CVs and apply for jobs. These are important trainings for sure, and we'll talk a little bit about how they interact with the sort of substantive formal and non-formal trainings in just a moment, but they don't form the focus of this evaluation, in part because they're just too small. So in general, these measures to improve competitiveness last a day or 7 hours of contact time on average. So it's quite difficult to pick up their effects econometrically. So this is what the trainings look like that we're trying to evaluate. From a kind of econometric perspective, from a statistical perspective, there's a couple of things that makes evaluating training programs in Latvia's labour market slightly difficult. And they are the timing of the training within people's unemployment spells, and also the fact that training is often combined with other active labour market policy measures. So what this slide is showing is it's kind of a histogram, or what you might call like a kernel density, showing the timing of when trainings arise within people's unemployment spells as per the administrative data. What we see at the median is that about 160 days elapse between registering as unemployed and the start of formal training programs, which is the light blue line. And then up to sort of 200 plus days elapse between registration with the State Employment Agency and non-formal training beginning. So this queuing time is something we'll touch on a little bit later when we talk about the voucher system. But it sort of presents a problem, a sort of slight difficulty for us econometrically, because not only are trainings starting relatively late within the period of registered unemployment, but there's also an enormous amount of variation when they start. This is not just one spike at one particular time when these trainings are kicking off. They vary quite a lot. They vary quite a lot, and they differ in general from the timing at which other active labour market policies begin. So this is something that econometrically presents us with a slight complication. As I mentioned, the other complication, which is not shown here, but I'll just touch on, is that, and it makes sense, active labour market policies often come in combinations. So it's very difficult to kind of separate out specific treatment groups where people have only been trained or only not been trained. Sometimes training will be combined, in particular with support for regional mobility, with employment services. And sometimes training will be combined sort of with each other. We know that sort of 1/3 of the formal training participants at some point received a non-formal training as well. And about 15% of those receiving non-formal training also received a formal training at some point as well, or participated, I should say, in a formal training as well. So we've got variation in timing, and we've got multiple participations. So hardly kind of clean treatment and control groups that one would hope to have for an econometric analysis. Okay, so with these complex patterns of participation, what we need is some kind of pragmatic econometric approach that can help us deal with that can help us estimate the treatment effects, the effects of these trainings on employment, on earnings, and on various labour market outcomes. And I think sort of when we started this project, we had to kind of go back to basics and think, well, like what does econometrics really do? What are we trying to do when we estimate the treatment effect? And really, like, impact evaluations rely on this issue of constructing a counterfactual, on thinking, well, okay, we've got these training participants. What would have happened to these people had they not participated in the training? What would the difference have been for that group if they had not participated in the training? Of course, This is something we never observe in practice, and all of these methods, be it randomized controlled trials or inferential studies, are really trying to construct this counterfactual, trying to construct this like what-if scenario in order to enable us to assess the effectiveness of training or other active labour market policies or labour market policies in general. So this becomes slightly complicated in the context of training because what we can't do is, so I'm just going to bring up some of my, there we go. What we can't do is simply compare the outcomes of those who were trained with those who were never trained. Those who were never trained don't serve as a particularly useful counterfactual for those who are trained because, as we saw in the previous slide, people are entering training relatively late in their unemployment spell. And so what this means is the never trained people, well, they might be people that are just waiting in unemployment for a long time, but what they might also be is people that are just very quickly going into unemployment and then coming straight back out again. And so those people are going to have those people that go in and come back straight back out again are likely to have more motivation. They'll have been participating in the labour market longer, while our trained people will have been kind of locked in, if you like, into staying unemployed and participating in training. So we have to take account of the fact that there's a sort of dynamic process through which people select into training, rather than simply comparing the ever trained with the never trained. And the way we do this is it comes back again to the administrative data. We look at individuals so we construct intervention and comparison groups at each individual month at which we observe people. And so if we take, for example, month 4, what does that look like? Well, at month 4, like people that make it that long into the unemployment spell have similar characteristics in the sense that they've lasted that long in unemployment, so they're not those people that have nipped in and then nipped out of the unemployment spell. And then we can construct the intervention group as those people that start the training in, say, month 4. The comparison group being those that start treatment later, so start the training later or never at all. But you know they're still hanging around in unemployment in month 4, so they do serve as a reasonable comparison group in that sense. And then what we do in month 4 is we drop anyone who's started training already or found employment beforehand, so they're no longer hanging around as a registered unemployed person in month 4. And then what we can do is we can do that for all of the potential months of unemployment. So we can construct an intervention and comparison group for all the potential months of the unemployment spell, aggregate all those results, and this gives us a much better chance of constructing that counterfactual, thinking about what the treatment effects from training might be, in spite of this sort of dynamic selection on an observed process. And each time we do one of these comparisons within a particular month, again, we can improve the quality of that comparison using the detailed administrative data because it gives us an awful lot of information on people's background characteristics, their employment histories, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, to sort of underline the importance of the administrative data, it just simply wouldn't be possible if we didn't observe people at all these different points in time throughout their unemployment spell, and we didn't observe all their detailed participations in training or other active labour market policies. Okay, so that's a little bit on the econometric approach, which is slightly technical. So moving again to the kind of killer graph that Stefano presented earlier. What we've seen is overall very positive effects from training, which are robust to applying the econometric approach that I just described a moment ago. So what we're showing here in the blue line is sort of set number of months after the training begins, what was the percentage point increase in employment chances for those that did formal training in the dark blue and non-formal training in the grey. And we also have the confidence intervals that show us that this is not purely down to random chance. So these are the 5% confidence intervals, showing us that these results are statistically significant, showing us that these results are not just down to random variation in the data, and we can believe that there's a causal effect of training. At the 18-month mark, what we see is formal training increasing the likelihood of being in employment by around 8 percentage points, and formal training doing so by around 5 percentage points. And then in terms of earnings at the same time, it's what we see is non-formal training having a slightly larger effect of about 6%, whereas formal training having an effect of around 2%. So in terms of employment chances, we see sort of stronger effects, slightly stronger effects from formal training than non-formal training. In terms of the impact on earnings amongst those who found a job, we see slightly more impact from non-formal training than we do from formal training. And what's nice is these results sort of roughly echo what was seen in the previous World Bank study. There's some slight differences in the magnitudes, some slight differences in the way that non-formal training performs in terms of earnings. But what this means is that, even using a slightly different methodology from what was used in the World Bank study, even though our data come from a slightly later period, we're sort of slowly starting to triangulate really what's quite a positive image in terms of Latvia's, the success of training programs for the unemployed in Latvia. One thing that I'll mention, which is not shown on the slide, is a kind of subgroup analysis we did to look at how training affects different populations differently. And I think that there's a couple of points to emphasize on this. One is that firstly, we see sort of slightly different effects for women deriving higher benefits from formal training, while men doing so from non-formal training. Workers aged more than 30 years derived higher benefits from non-formal training. And also what we see is those on social assistance also deriving higher benefits from formal training than those who are not on social assistance, at least after a kind of long time period. So there's some differences between the way that people are benefiting from training. But what we also see is that most groups do benefit in some way. So there's a remarkable amount of flexibility in the way that training has affected people's labour market outcomes in Latvia, and this gives the State Employment Agency a certain amount of adaptability in the way it targets training programmes. One other thing to mention, I think, in terms of the kind of heterogeneity of training's results, is the extent to which training, when combined with other active labour market policies, has greater effects. And I'll just mention briefly that sort of it seems that combining training with efforts to support regional mobility, so allowing people to have better access to training providers that are not necessarily close to them or not necessarily local to their place of residence, seems to boost at least the earnings impact of training, as shown here. And so you might say this is sort of partly about selection. It's very difficult to know whether those people that are doing regional mobility programs, receiving regional mobility support alongside training, are more motivated in some ways. But what this could also be, and what we think is probably going on, is that supporting people's regional mobility to attend trainings that are far away enables a better match between the type of training and the training provider, and also the particular person improving the outcomes for training. Okay. I'll just move quickly on to talk about some of the sort of areas for improvement that come out of the review. And one of these is the way that the voucher system functions in Latvia's in terms of providing training for the unemployed in Latvia. So vouchers sort of consist of a physical document that people can receive at the State Employment Agency. They contain all sorts of information about how the voucher can be used. And what they do is they enable people to choose a particular provider with some guidance from the caseworkers and from the State Employment Agency in order to find a good match between the unemployed person and provider. And the idea is to boost choice. That's good in itself, but improves the match. Boost competition amongst training providers. People can vote with their feet if they think training providers are not providing quality or relevant training. And also fosters sort of transparency in the system as a whole. There's no kind of complicated tender processes through which training is provided. However, the voucher system, as Stefano mentioned, faces three particular challenges. Some disadvantaged groups may need support in exercising choice and redeeming their vouchers. What we see is young people and also people with a weaker command of the Latvian language being less likely to go on and actually redeem their vouchers after having received it. So this might sort of might lead us to think that caseworkers need to provide a little bit more support there to help those people exercise effective choice. Individuals also have to wait a long time to actually receive their vouchers. We looked a little bit at the waiting times from registration to actual training start a moment ago. But there's also a sort of waiting period when individuals have been told they're to be assigned to the training, but have not actually yet received their voucher, during which time their status is slightly unclear, and it might sort of compound some of the lock-in effects, some of the mechanical forces that keep people in unemployment longer, particularly if they don't know whether they should be searching for a training provider, not having received their voucher, searching for work, or doing something else. And then finally, training providers are distributed slightly unevenly across Latvia as a whole. So this map shows where the concentration of state employment agency accredited training providers are situated in Latvia. These are known as kind of state SEA partners, and is also dividing it by the kind of thousands of unemployed people. So we can see kind of the relative, if you like, demand relative to the kind of number of providers. And there's kind of a few things that jump out. Firstly, there's kind of whole swathes of the country where municipalities have no state-accredited provider in the south and also in the west. So those people are likely to need support to reach particular training providers. But the opposite is true in the east of the country. And then the picture is a little bit more mixed in urban areas. But all of this points to support for regional mobility being an important component of Latvia's active labour market policies, particularly as training providers are being consolidated at this moment. And this may have an effect on choice and competition, which needs to be carefully monitored. We touched also on the period that individuals have been assigned to the training and how it's probably better to shorten the time when they've been assigned to voucher recipiency and increase the time for which vouchers are actually valid, as well as looking for other ways to limit lock-in effects, be that allowing sort of job search to happen alongside training or other things, and needing to focus more on the disadvantaged groups. So those are some of the summary kind of key messages from training. I will just quickly talk about a regional mobility program because I'm sort of becoming aware that we're slightly running out of time. As was mentioned earlier, there's relatively large differences between Latvia's regions, and this presents a potential challenge, but also a potential opportunity in terms of supporting people back to work. So in 2013, a policy was introduced, an activation measure that provides kind of financial support for people to take up not just training, but also actual employment that's situated more than 20 kilometres, although the limit has been moved to 15 kilometres, away from their place of residence. And this is really to cover transport and housing. And as is no surprise, lots of these people are coming from outside of Riga and generally moving towards Riga itself. So in a sense, this is supporting some of the natural migration flows that are happening anyway, but it's supporting it for those people that might be constrained and might be unable to make moves otherwise. Again, what we face is sort of econometrically is the challenge of finding amongst those people that participated in the regional mobility program, amongst those that received that financial support, the challenge we face is once again one of trying to find a counterfactual for those people. So trying to find a suitable control group of people that was similar to those people that participated, but they themselves did not participate. And the way that we've done this for the regional mobility program is to look. If we sort of focus on Model 1, which is when the program for regional mobility was introduced, we take kind of registered unemployed people as the treatment group, that's the intervention group, because all of those people suddenly became eligible for this program in 2013. And then other persons in unemployment, be they unemployed or not, serve as the comparison group, serve as the control group in this particular circumstance. Now, you might think those two groups are quite different from one another for a whole host of characteristics, which might affect kind of the effectiveness of the program. And so we do sort of two things to improve the quality of the comparisons we make between these treatment and control groups. Again, just focusing on Model 1. In particular, what we use is a sort of methodological difference in differences. So we, rather than looking at the kind of level of mobility just after the program was introduced, the regional mobility support program was introduced, what we look at is the change in the changes. So how much did mobility improve for the registered unemployed groups, the treatment group, relative to how much did mobility improve for the control group, those other persons in unemployment, other persons who are not in employment. And once more, we were able to draw on the sort of length of the administrative data set and also the detail, which brings us on to the second point, that we were able to control for all sorts of time-varying variables that might also affect the quality of these comparisons.
5 minutes. That's a brutal world.
Okay. So as Stefano mentioned earlier, there's reason to believe this program works. When it was introduced, the probabilities of moving to take up a new job are pretty low, but they sort of roughly doubled or increased by half, depending on your perspective, for the introduction of that model. And so we can be fairly sure this has had fairly positive effects on people's ability to take up jobs and employment abroad in other regions of Latvia. But there's potential room for improvement, and so I'll just finish by emphasising the point that while this potentially works well for young people that aren't attached and don't have families or aren't in couples, it will probably be more effective for families and couples to provide additional assistance besides the €150 per month. That wouldn't necessarily have to be the money itself, but it could be potentially linking with potential credit providers. And also sort of linking this with the profiling system could ensure that regional mobility support comes to people quicker. Currently, people have to wait 2 months for this thing to kick in. What we could have is this link to the profiling immediately going, and then affecting people in a targeted way in that period when regional mobility support is most likely to be most effective. And with that, I'll pass over to Teodora, who's somehow going to wrap up in 5 minutes, but we'll see. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So actually, I have very good news, because we're going to break for lunch now, because we still have to go through 3 programs, 1 in detail and 2 in less detail. And because these are employment programs and very much related to the discussion we will have in the second panel today on vulnerable groups, I'm going to give a very short presentation at the beginning of that panel discussion, which will, let's say, summarize the findings on these 3 programs. So good news, lunch break now, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Applause, ladies and gentlemen. Un tā arī, kā pieteikts, nekavējot, mūs šobrīd ir maltītes pauze. Maltīte mums atrodas tepat, izejot pa durvīm pa kreisi, veicinot mūsu pašu mobilitāti 20 metrus tālāk, lai jums spēcinoši maltīti, un atgriežamies pēc tam ar intensīvām diskusijām 2 paneļos, 1,5 stunda, pēc tam kafijas pauze un vēlreiz 1,5 stunda, kur veiksim sazobi ar Latvijas realitāti no iepriekš minētā. Labu apetīti!